Hey everyone, today I'm going to be talking about Game Porting Toolkit version 1.1. So Game Porting Toolkit is Apple's developer tool which allows you to test out various Windows games on the Mac. This includes DirectX 12 titles like Cyberpunk 2077, Elden Ring, Hogwarts Legacy, Diablo 4, etc. Many previously unplayable DirectX 12 games can now be tested on the Mac, all thanks to this Apple developer tool. But what's really interesting is that Game Porting Toolkit 1.1 was not actually made available to Apple developers at first. For at least a couple of days, the only way to access this tool was to use something called Crossover. And CodeWeavers, the developers of Crossover, released Crossover 23.7 beta, which incorporated Game Porting Toolkit 1.1 even before you could actually download it from the Apple developer website. And this is really interesting to me because Apple and CodeWeavers basically have completely different visions of what Mac gaming is going to look like in the future. And now the fact that Apple are now working so closely with CodeWeavers could mark the start of a complete shift in Mac gaming strategy. And today I'm going to be talking about some of these implications and what the future of Mac gaming might look like.
So just to give a little bit of history, Apple released the Game Porting Toolkit back in June 2023 during the Worldwide Developers Conference. And clearly this is a tool designed for developers to use only. It's not really for gamers and customers. There's no graphical user interface, everything's handled through terminal commands, and there isn't really support for third-party launchers like Steam, GOG, Epic, etc. However, gamers managed to access the Apple developer site, download the tool, and actually co-opt it to be used in various demanding DirectX 12 titles like Cyberpunk 2077 and get them running on a Mac for the first time. And what people discovered is that Apple hadn't actually made their own translation layer from scratch as they implied. In reality, what they had done is use an open source project called Wine, which has been used to run Windows games and applications on macOS and Linux for decades now. And they plugged in their own proprietary graphics translation layer called D3D Metal, which allows you to run DirectX 11 and 12 titles and translate them to Metal, which is used on iOS devices as well as Mac computers as well. And really the whole point of this translation layer is to actually get developers and publishers interested in porting their existing and future PC, Windows and console titles into native ARM applications which use the Metal Graphics API directly, not the translation layer, and get these games into the Apple ecosystem, not just on macOS but iPadOS, iOS, and get them onto the App Store where Apple really make most of their money. And to this end, Apple decided to make D3D Metal a closed source project, and they added restrictive licensing so that you couldn't add it to commercial projects. It's really only for testing, so that you can't just add D3D Metal, wrap it in Wine, and then ship it as an actual game. Apple want their software to run as smoothly as possible. They don't want janky translation layers. They want beautifully coded native ARM games that take full advantage of the Metal Graphics API and could even be ported to other more profitable platforms like the iPad or the iPhone. However, whilst it's nice to imagine that we're going to have a full library of macOS games which are going to satisfy everyone, the fact is that the native Mac game library is actually quite small, especially when you compare it to all of the games that you can play on Microsoft Windows computers and on traditional game consoles too. And whilst Apple has made big strides in encouraging some game developers to make native ARM games for Mac, the fact is that the Mac gaming user base is far too small when you compare it to consoles and PC. And so if you want to have a fulfilling Mac gaming experience, you're going to have to turn to emulation and translation in order to access the wider library of games. So this is where a tool like Crossover comes into play. So Crossover makes use of Wine to translate Windows games so that can be played on a Mac. Crossover itself is not open source, however it's based on open source technology, and the company behind it, called CodeWeavers, are the main contributor behind the Wine project. So effectively, if you're making a purchase of Crossover, you're also directly supporting Wine development, which is the underlying technology behind Game Porting Toolkit, as well as Proton, which powers gaming on the Steam Deck. Now the whole point of Crossover is to act as a translation layer so that you can get Windows games which aren't compatible on the Mac working well on Apple Silicon hardware. And whilst CodeWeavers do have a branch where they help developers and publishers port their Windows console games onto Mac, Crossover itself is a commercial product being sold to end users right now, which allows you to translate the games which aren't already compatible natively on macOS. Therefore, if you really think about it, Crossover actually benefits from there being fewer Mac games games. If every single Windows console game had a Mac version, then there would be no need for Wine or crossover. And this is directly opposed to Apple's stated goals for Game Porting Toolkit, which is to encourage more Mac gaming development. If Apple endorses a translation layer, then there is a chance that some gamers will actually play a game through the translation layer first, instead of waiting for a native macOS port to come. And this would further disincentivize developers and publishers from bringing their games to the macOS platform. However, despite these conflicting goals, it actually looks like Apple and CodeWeavers have been working together, especially for the last few months. So ever since the release of Game Porting Toolkit 0.4, there's been a change in the licensing agreement which allows the inclusion of D3D Metal into non-commercial projects. This has allowed Game Porting Toolkit to be integrated into open source tools like Whiskey, CX Patcher, etc. However, I would argue that Crossover is actually a commercial project, it's closed source, and you need to pay for a license in order to use it. So some legal exception has definitely been made between Apple and CodeWeavers for this inclusion to even be possible. And now the fact is that Game Porting Toolkit 1.1 and the latest version of D3D Metal have been included in Crossover 23.7 beta even before Apple developers had access to it on the official Apple developer site. This could be an indication that Apple are changing their Mac gaming strategy overall. Now really the fact that Game Porting Toolkit was fed to CodeWeavers first could just be a mistake. It could be that they just forgot to upload the developer version until a couple of days later, or it could be that they thought that CodeWeavers would be the best team to do all of the initial testing, or maybe this is the start of Apple's brand new Mac gaming strategy, and they're working with CodeWeavers and Crossover in order to make something happen for the Mac, a little bit like how Valve worked with CodeWeavers as well to create the Proton compatibility layer, which allows all of those Windows games to work so well on the Steam Deck. Now I know it sounds kind of crazy. I'm basically saying that Apple are condoning something as janky as a translation layer in order to get games working on a Mac. But there is a kind of precedent for function over form with Apple. So for example, the whole backtracking around the butterfly keyboard and making Macs a little bit thicker, this really made a lot of Mac users happy in the end. Even though it sacrificed Apple's goal of getting a thinner and thinner MacBook every year, Apple customers were way happier with the thicker keyboards, especially in the Apple Silicon Macs. And in reality, I think most gamers don't really care if their game is running through a translation layer as long as it works well. And I think that's proven with the success of the Steam Deck. Now with Game Porting Toolkit, you've already seen what is possible when Apple decides and intervenes in this gaming space. The creation of D3D Metal and translating DirectX 12 games into the Metal Graphics API. It's something that CodeWeavers has been working on but probably wouldn't have achieved for at least 5 to 10 years. So it's really exciting to think about what Apple and CodeWeavers could achieve if they decided to explicitly work together to create a new Mac gaming translation layer. If the Apple Silicon Mac had compatibility with as many Windows games as say the Steam Deck does, then it would completely transform the way that people view the Mac as a gaming platform. And if Apple put their minds to it, they could solve all of the technical issues that CodeWeavers currently face, and maybe even integrate future game technologies like VR, ray tracing, direct storage, etc. So anyway, this video has been a lot of speculation about why Apple and CodeWeavers are working so tightly together with Game Porting Toolkit. If you have any theories, then please make sure to leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.